Hey YouTube. So I just finished playing a game called The Little Nightmares, and I don't know, I just kind of got this vibe from it the entire time, and so I ended up looking online to see what other people thought the storyline was about, or anything really that I could find, reviews and whatever that were talking about people's interpretation of the game itself and whatnot. And I guess I'm completely alone on my interpretation of it. A lot of people were talking about the story and trying to fill in some of the gaps that are there, or some of the unspoken parts of it, and this and that. And really just kind of, I felt like everybody was just explaining the narrative, and or I guess in this case lack thereof. But I just personally didn't feel like they were kind of saying anything interesting about it, at least as interesting as I found the game. So, The Little Nightmares. It's a basic story of, this little girl. Her name is Six, and she wakes up in this place and then goes through a whole bunch of different things and eventually gets to, the wicked boss type character at the end, and then defeats her and moves on. Very basic story, and I know it's a little bit more involved than that, of course, and if you want to see other people's interpretation of the story, then go ahead and watch their videos. But myself, I couldn't help the entire time feeling as though the story was actually more of an abstract representation of child trafficking. And it was something that, I started to get the feeling of that, and then I just couldn't shake the feeling. It kept on kind of just every kind of little thing that I was seeing coming forth in regards to let's start off at the beginning, for example, actually, like the fact that she wakes up in a suitcase. Now, a lot of people have interpreted this as, okay, well, Six wakes up in a suitcase, she's been there a long time, or she escaped and now she's living out of this suitcase or whatever, and that's fine. That's a pretty good explanation. I'm not trying to downplay anybody else's explanation. I'm just saying that mine was not that at all. My interpretation of that, looking back on it, of course, because not immediately the moment the game started, I was thinking, it's about child trafficking. I felt that it was more like, because I've heard many stories about how that's one of the means that they actually transport these children, is just like in suitcases and whatever. You just cram them in there and away they go. So the fact that she was in a suitcase as well was one of those things that sort of, I was like, wow, it's interesting that's a detail that's there. And then you have the first, I guess you could say the first character that you come across, which is the hanging, the obviously hanging from, everyone assumes, a noose. You just see two long dangling legs, and everybody assumes that it's clearly an adult, and everybody has assumed that it's her Six's father. And I agree with that. The thing that I don't agree with is that let's call her the geisha, the end boss, is her mother. And that the father, was part of the whole thing and then ended up, committing suicide because he was banished there, I think was what somebody was saying. And I think that just kind of is more far-fetched. It's more taking the game as literal as possible. And I think that was the first and foremost sort of mistake of everybody looking in and interpreting what this storyline was actually about. Because the game is The Little Nightmares. And that immediately sets me to believe, okay, well, this is clearly a surreal world. It's a nightmare. It's in the mind. It's a dream. It could be it's an incredibly long dream sequence, let's say. And at that point, nothing in the game, in my opinion, at that point should be taken literally anymore. Everything is a representation of something else, just like in a dream. So the dangling feet, the father who has committed suicide, it is that. But it doesn't have to go beyond sort of interpreting, oh, he's the father and this happened and he was exiled and blah, 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 and then that means the geisha's the mother. That starts getting into this, taking everything a little bit too much on face value. I think that was just a representation of a father, or actually not necessarily just the father, it's a representation of parents, or one parent or both, being heavily depressed, sad, potentially suicidal, if not actually committing suicide because they've lost their child. Their child is now gone. Doesn't mean that the person committed suicide right there in that room. From each room to room, it's almost like its own vacuum world. It doesn't necessarily have to. Of course, the game does have a flow to it and everything, but it's still like a dream. And so it's still just representation. Now, the second character that you come across is what everybody has labeled as the kidnapper. And I agree with that too. He definitely has a kidnapper vibe to him. There's many things about him that sort of represent this. His long arms, for example, the long arms that the child can't escape, so on and so forth. And the things that he does in the game. Now, the other thing is that I feel that he has a very heavy undertone of being a pedophile. There's just something about, like, when he catches you, his face and the different, it just seems like that. Now, another thing about him too is that he cannot see, and people think that he can hear really well, but I don't think that he can hear either. Because if you look like at the mask that he's wearing, it's wrapped over his eyes and his ears. And when he catches wind of you, right? When he's aware of your presence, he always sniffs the air. He goes, he's sniffing around. So he smells it. Now, he can't see and he can't hear, which is like this whole old saying, see no evil and hear no evil. That, to me, is a very clever thing to put on the character, because what he is as the kidnapper is the in-between guy. He kidnaps the kids, and then he gives them to the geisha. He gives them to this organization, right? In the game, he kidnaps the kids and he gives them to the kitchen, the cooks. And I'll get into that. But he's the middleman. He doesn't really, that person isn't really necessarily even aware of what's going on. He just knows he's being paid to get children. That's it. Beyond that, he hears no evil, sees no evil. He doesn't really know what's going on, that these kids are being given to basically a ring of pedophiles. If he's not a pedophile himself, of course. And like I said, I do get the feeling, because there's certain things about him that made me feel as though he was. So this is just another interpretation that I had of him. Now, him giving him to the kitchen, to the cooks. In the game, of course, you're seen as the kidnapper gives the bodies of the children to the cooks cut up the meat, create meals for, at the end of the game, these adults coming in, these very gluttonous adults, to come in and just feast on child meat. Again, if you take that extremely literal, then that's all it is. I personally think that, again, it's a very deep representation of what's truly going on, which is the cooks are the people that prepare these children, prepares their meat to be consumed, but not prepares their flesh to be consumed, but not in the way that, to satisfy a hunger in the stomach. It's to satisfy the sexual need of these sexual predator adults, this circle of adults that go there to do this. Who knows, I'm not going to get into any kind of grisly details that I've heard too much in this video. If you're interested to learn more about this stuff, then, by all means, corrupt your own brain yourself with it. But suffice to say, that's the type of stuff that goes on. There's different brainwashing and physical things that happen to these children in order to prepare them to basically become sex slaves, and then they're auctioned off. And then that leads to the sort of final parts of the game, where there's these adults that come in and they're gluttonous and everything. They're represented as very fat people that just eat, that can't stop eating, and that's the gluttony, the desire, the perversion, the disgusting nature of the pedophile. He can't get enough. He needs the flesh of children, or she needs the flesh of children. Sexually, though, in this game, that sexuality is just represented by eating food. And then the geisha as well was one of the things that led me to believe that this is really what it was about, because a geisha doesn't run a restaurant. Geisha and restaurant, not as much of a historical tie to that as there is with prostitution. A geisha is much more sexualized than that. So why choose a very sexualized looking character who is also obsessed with her looks and so on and so forth, if you're not still trying to represent this whole thing that I'm talking about, which is child trafficking? So even the geisha herself, being a geisha, led me to believe that, okay, yeah, she's the head ringmaster of this whole circle of pedophilia, basically. So that's it. There are a couple of other small details here and there. Currently, my channel is not really that active, so I don't really spend too much time on these videos, and it's already pushing past 10 minutes with this already. So I'm going to leave it here. If people start to view these things and it picks up and I'm asked, I will go into a lot more detail about things that lead me to do very specific things during the game that are other sort of hints that this is actually what this game is talking about. So I hope you enjoy the video, even though it's a very grisly topic. The game is amazing one way or another, and I really suggest if anybody out there hasn't played it, I haven't spoiled anything here, so go ahead and play it. It's a really fun game.